I'm going to take you on a real quick tour through the history of Park Boulevard Presbyterian Church using the wall of many of the pastors who have served this church over the last almost 110 years. Park Boulevard Presbyterian Church started as just a Sunday school in the brand new Glenview neighborhood in 1910. And then actually became constituted officially as a Presbyterian church in 1913. It was during that period that the church got their first property and built their first building and eventually added a belfry and a bell and all that. And they called their first pastor, who was John Donaldson, a real firebrand and really helped to get the church started. And then he was followed by Reverend Tom Oliver, who was here through the rest of the 20s up through 1930. And then here, Dr. Rollo Laporte, who was here until 1937, and then went on to become the president of Dubuque University back in Iowa. So had a very interesting career. And then Dr. Paul Goodwin was here from 1937 to 1945. In the 1930s, the church moved from its property about a block away, and it started out as St. James Presbyterian Church. They got the property over here on Park Boulevard on the corner of Park and Hample. They broke ground and they named the church Park Boulevard Presbyterian Church. They built a Gothic-style sanctuary and a gym, and then about 10 years later in the 1930s they built the three-story education building, which is still here today. And Ben Weir is one of them, but he's noteworthy. He was only here for a year or two, but back in the 1980s he was one of the hostages in Lebanon because he was serving as a university or seminary professor over there. So he has national fame. He was a household name back in the 80s. Dr. Ridings was the longest serving pastor here at Park Boulevard Presbyterian Church, here from 1946 to 1960. This was really the period where the church really just reached its greatest peak. Churches all over the country were growing in the 1950s after World War II. During this time, Park Boulevard got to over 1,000 members. And under Dr. Lauren Ridings, that beautiful Gothic sanctuary that was built in the 1920s was torn down and replaced with the larger modern sanctuary that we have today, which was built in 1956. Dr. Ridings has particular interest for me because when he left here in 1960, he went to Fremont and became the pastor of Centerville Presbyterian Church, which is my home church. I was born there in 1969, and my middle name, incidentally, is Lauren, and Lorin. And when I had my first child, my daughter, we named her Lauren, spelled differently, but that legacy of that name lives on. So I have this personal connection with this church. Bob Morrison followed. He was an associate here. He followed Dr. Ridings down to Fremont as well and became an associate there at my home church. And so I know many members of his family. And his son-in-law, Mark Laverton, is the president of Fuller Seminary today. James Baird was the pastor here in the 1960s, from 64 to 69. He comes from a whole family of pastors. His father was a pastor at First Presbyterian Church of Oakland. His son was a pastor at Sacramento at Fremont Presbyterian Church, and his grandson today is a pastor at Burlingame Press over across the bay. So that brings us back over to this side to the 1970s, where Reverend Clark was here from 1973 to 1980. In the 1980s, we had Dr. Ron Thompson, who was here from 1983 to 1991. His associate, Jeff Bridgman. Many people who are still here in the church today remember the two of them and their ministry here. Herbert Tweedy was a parish associate. Dr. Alvin Coons, no relation to me, was a parish associate also. In the 1990s, Reverend Carl Hoffman was the pastor here, and he was the second longest serving pastor here from 92 to 2002, and we actually had him come back and preach for us on our celebration of the 100th anniversary of Park back in 1913, which was a special occasion. Bob Ross was also a parish associate, and he was one of my seminary professors teaching me church history back in the 1990s. Reverend Chris Coon was here from 2005 to 2010, and we had Dr. George Gilchrist as our interim pastor, both before Reverend Gelini and following Reverend Gelini. And I'll be right there from, let's see, 2012 to 2021. So that is the history of Park Boulevard through the portraits of the pastors over the years.